We're going to transition to a plenary discussion now that I think follows very well with the story that Freddie has shared with us. And it's really about the achievement gap issues that we see across the country. An issue that for decades we've talked about, but for decades the gap has not necessarily changed in where it is. And so I am honored to first invite up the four panelists that we have who are going to lead this. We're very excited to have the Missouri Commissioner of Education, Margie Van Dieven, the New York Commissioner of Education, Mary Ellen Alia, the Chair of the Washington House Education Committee, Representative Sharon Tamika Santos, and to moderate this discussion, we have Michael Petrelli, the President of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. And as they're getting situated up here on the stage,
Mary Ellen Alia.
I want to take a quick moment to share a couple of slides to kind of lay the story here. So if we can move to the first of the slides. I talked yesterday in my speech about how we can slice and dice the data for student outcomes all we'd like, but the more we look at it, whether it's geographic, by state, whether it's by ethnicity, by race, by income level, the lowest performing students in most of our areas have increased their outcomes, but over the last 10 to 20 years, they've increased their outcomes only to where the highest performing students were 10 years ago. This first slide illustrates that, and that's available in your resources. The second slide that I have is really looking at the growing gap in gaining a college degree by family income. If we accept the notion that 60% of the jobs by 2025 will require some post-secondary education or certification, this slide scares me, because there is a growing gap between the income levels and who actually obtains some kind of post-secondary degree. These are important numbers. They're data that we can go through a million different ways. Many of you are looking at these in your state. But there's a lot of other data that matter to this. I mean, what are the number of students who are expelled from classes or given 1-week suspensions? How does that apply in similar areas? The final slide is not so much education, but I think it shows where there are diversions in our country and a question on how can we, as the education sector, work on some of these issues. This shows trends in family dinners by parental education. I showed this to my children, and they actually wish that my wife and I had not gone to college because they like the idea of less family dinners. But I think it is a big issue. There's a lot of social settings that are applied in this that's not just what's happening between 8 and 3 in the classroom on some of these gap issues. So I'm really excited for the discussion that we're going to have for the next 45 minutes. We'll have some opportunity for some Q&A. And Michael, with that, I'm going to turn it over to you to lead the discussion.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Jeremy. And boy, well, that was a really easy presentation to follow, right? Yes. Wow, what an amazing speech. And yeah, now we're going to have a policy wonk panel after that. We'll do our best. You know, as Jeremy said, this is an incredibly important conversation. Of course, it's not a new conversation. It's something that we have talked about in education forever, which is that we know, of course, that our schools face all kinds of challenges when they are trying to do their best by kids who are coming in from very difficult circumstances. And we will have these debates all the time about, you know, whether schools alone can close the achievement gap or whether there need to be bigger and broader efforts. I think all of us would agree, regardless of what side of the political or ideological spectrum we are on, that of course schools cannot do it all. But the question for us, for those of us that have an impact on the education system is our education system doing all it can do to help kids growing up in poverty have a real shot at making it to the middle class and have the kind of phenomenal success that we just heard about this morning. So with that framing, I'm going to let the policymakers really lead here and give us some perspective from where they sit on what we can be doing more to make sure that kids growing up facing the challenges of poverty do have those opportunities. So really with that simple framing, let's get started, and then you know, we'll dig in as we go. So why don't you go ahead and start, Representative?
Can you tell me where the timer is?
Oh, right there. Yeah, you have a hard time seeing it, can't you? But I'll bug you.
Okay.
How about that? If
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to all of you. I'm very excited about this topic. It's something that I have a great deal of passion for. And I want to start by just making a note. You'll see that the title of my slide is Closing the Opportunity Gap in Washington State. And I want to point out that the language that we use is reflective of the lens that we often use to view a problem, and as a result, it actually helps define the parameters of the solution that we allow ourselves to envision. So most of us know that the achievement gap refers to the significant and persistent differences in academic performance and educational attainment between groups of students. It's measurable and it shows up in standardized tests, high school dropout rates, completion rates, course selection, and other outcome-based metrics. Many efforts that try to focus on solving the achievement gap see the student, the family, or the community as the challenge or the problem in need of fixing. The impact of this kind of thinking really was most powerfully asserted in my presence a few years ago by a young Samoan student who was attending a Pacific Islander student empowerment conference. And she asserted to the assembled group of student district staff, administrators, and lawmakers such as myself, and I'm quoting, "My identity, my family, and my community are not barriers to my success." It was a chilling moment for me that reminded me of the persistent and pervasive legacy of that 19th century assimilation education technique that was best described as, it was the Indian boarding schools where they talked about killing the Indian to save the man. So let me instead offer a different perspective that I think recognizes the achievement gap actually as a symptom of a deeper challenge, a problem of disparities and differentiation entrenched within systems and structures of most American schools and districts. Focusing on these kinds of inequities in teacher assignment, in curriculum, course offerings, in parent and community involvement approaches, and multiple other ways redirects our attention and our energy into fixing the system rather than finding fault with the students and their natural systems of support. So in other words, I invite you to consider the achievement gap as the logical outcome of an educational opportunity gap where practices and policies as well as resources are disparately experienced by students who are in the gap. I do want to, I don't know where my lady is, who's moving the slides.
There you go.
Thank you. I do want to, I have provided some information in the app around some legislation that we passed in Washington this last year, but I really wanted to focus today on the why and the rationale for that. And so I wanted to use this anecdote, and it involves the grandchild of one of my colleagues. And the grandchild was entered into kindergarten. And the teacher was engaged in an animal identification exercise with flashcards. And so sitting in front of the child, she was saying, "Please name this animal." And so the child says to the teacher, "Oh, well, that is Kalahek, which is a sacred mammal in the Coast Salish tribes of the Pacific Northwest." "No," the teacher said, "wrong answer." So the child was confused, and she said, "Well, orca?" And the teacher said, "No, try again." Now, the student was really quite befuddled. And she paused for a really long time, and she finally said, "Killer whale?" At which point the teacher praised her for identifying the right name. This child had 3 correct names for the animal that you see before you, but the teacher could only see 1 correct answer. Why do I share that anecdote? I think it really describes some of the basic changes that have to take place within the systems and structures that deal with our awareness and how we work with other cultures and the families and the communities from which our students derive their points of view, their values, and the way they look at the world. I want to move to the next slide very quickly and just note something that all of you are aware of, and that is we have not set up the system to prepare for students such as the ones who are appearing on your screen. We know that classrooms today are more and more diverse. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves as practitioners and policymakers is, what's at stake if the system is not prepared to help every student succeed? As you are looking at these children, this is a small snapshot of my family. And the child who will appear last is one of our youngest grandchildren, who was born with a congenital heart defect. And when we met him at 2 weeks old, he had all kinds of tubes coming out of his little tiny body after having open heart surgery. Our system does know that there are children with those kinds of special needs, recognizing that the system has to adapt to Sebastian's conditions and the developmental delays that we know he has. But we don't easily make the same transitions for all students and adapting the system to what their needs may be. I'm going to move to the next slide and say that this is a slide that was taken from Meadows Elementary School in Washington State, where I just brought my education committee. And I ask us to all consider, if we believe this statement, what would the system look like if we met every child where he or she is? I think that there is a moral imperative. We know that with more and more diverse students, if we are not educating them, not only will they face a lifetime of less earnings, but in fact, as a society, as governments, we could very well face higher costs, social costs, whether it's through higher costs in the welfare state, higher costs in corrections. And all of us have to face the fact that as I'm part of the baby boom generation, and we know we are not replicating ourselves. And so our security in our aging lives is also at risk because we are not replacing ourselves. So I will end with this final slide and ask you to consider, if we have created a system that doesn't meet every student where he or she is with a certain level of consciousness, what are we going to do to change the consciousness that created it in order to solve the problem?
Great. Thank you, Representative. Good. Commissioner.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here with all of you today. Thank you for having me. I'd like to just begin by sharing a little bit of historical perspective of what we've been doing in Missouri over the past decade, really focused on some of these critical issues. And I want to start by just explaining that we have been pretty assertive in what we could do in our school, in the locations in our school districts. So for example, we've closed low-performing districts, attached it to neighboring districts. We've removed locally elected boards and replaced with appointed boards in 3 districts using 3 different formats. We've opened charter schools. We've closed low-performing charter schools. We've enacted legislation now that allows students in unaccredited districts to transfer to higher-performing districts in neighboring areas and adjacent counties. And as of last week, they may now transfer to approved charter schools. And for several decades now, St. Louis area students have been allowed to participate in the voluntary interdistrict choice corporation, which is a program designed to increase racial integration. I say that because we've spent a lot of time, as you can tell, focusing on where to educate children in our policy discussions. And in the next point I'm going to make, we just in Missouri have moved through over about a 2-year process of looking at our standards, and in April, the State Board of Education approved revised Missouri Learning Standards for English Language Arts, Math, Science, and Social Studies. So the what that we just heard about, we've spent a lot of time talking about where and the what. That really now we are focused primarily on the how. How are we educating children in our schools? And as you alluded to, it is the systemic approach to what are we doing in our schools to improve opportunities for all children. And so our Top 10 by 20 plan, which is our state plan that we've been working on since 2011, really starts with that primary goal that all Missouri children will graduate ready to be successful in college, career, and life. And I open all of my remarks across the state really talking about if all means all, what will it take? If all means all, what will it take? When we know that in the state of Missouri, which is the Midwest, right in the core of the Midwest, we have now for the first time reached the threshold of more students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch than not. We know that 1 in 8 students qualifies for an individual education plan. While we certainly don't have an extensive ELL population, we do know that we are in the top percentage growth rate for English language learners in our state and across the nation. And we also know that when we look at how our top performing students are performing, they're not performing where they need to be performing either. And so we're really looking at all means all. What will it take to do that? And some of the things that we've been focusing on primarily has really been our first, you heard about that a little bit this morning, student engagement, relevancy. We've been working with our career and technical programs, Pathways to Prosperity, trying to make that work, school connection. We have done teacher externships, very pleased with how that's playing out. We're looking at how do we better manage our systems, our assessment systems. And I want to say this clearly, I'm not opposed to annual testing. But I do think we want to pay attention to how are we establishing those systems so that we find out where children really are and then move them along. So for example, we heard about Ty yesterday who had opportunities for dual credit. What about kids who take longer? Are we really dependent upon that 12-year education, or can we look at providing opportunities along the way to better meet kids where they are, so that 6th grader that's required to take the 6th grade test when they are at a 2nd grade reading level, that becomes a frustrating system for us. How do we move and meet kids where they are? I won't pretend to have the proficiency-based, competency-based learning thing figured out yet. I can just tell you we're very focused on looking at that as a state and how do we best meet our kids' needs in that direction. We have high expectations we're finding that balance between growth and achievement, because we do want to recognize individual student growth. As I was talking about those high flyers, how do we continue to move them forward? But also, if we just focus on growth, we want to make sure we do have that level of achievement in place. Critically important that our kids do graduate prepared to be successful. And when we hear about students graduating with the 6th grade reading level, it's very concerning to us. What do we do? So we've redesigned our statewide accountability system that does honor college and career readiness throughout, and it does look at multiple indicators. We've been doing that, operationalizing that for over 3 years now, and so some of the things that we're hearing about right now with the new Every Student Succeeds Act flexibility, we really have been doing that for quite some time. So for example, minor changes, but when we have a college and career readiness indicator, we use that grad file, our graduation file, and we look at what percentage of our students have taken, are scored on the ACT, the SAT, or the ASVAB, or work keys. We've used that already. We've been looking at another college and career readiness indicator is looking at how do students, what percentage of your graduates earned dual credit, but also AP or IB, and also industry recognized credentials. And the intent of all of that policy was designed at how do we find the interest of our children and move forward with that. Another key indicator that we've looked at for all children is looking at the attendance rates per child. So instead of looking at an aggregate attendance rate, we do what percentage of children are in school. So our metric is 90% of the children are there 90% of the time. It's pretty startling when you look at those numbers. And so when that chronic absentee report came out a couple of weeks ago, we were not surprised. We've been looking at that data for several years now, but it is pretty telling when you see the percentage of students who are not in school more than 10% of the time. The second point that we've really been working on is really building collective teacher efficacy. And so, great teaching matters, and we know that. And so how are we've been very, and this could be a whole session, so I'm not even going to go into it all, of all of the work that we've been very focused on and ensuring that we are recruiting and developing and attaining our best teachers. But we are starting, our primary focus right now is on principal development, and I really liked the sentence, we don't quite say it like this, but when Brandon said someone who encourages us in our daily development, I think that is so critical. That's what our whole evaluation system has been about in Missouri, is how do we help our teachers improve their craft, but how do we do that if we don't have principals who are trained in order to help them do that part? And so not that our principals need to deliver all of the material, but that our principals are asked the question, what are you doing to support your teachers and help them improve their craft? And then the third is that all Missouri children will come to school ready to learn. That's our early learning initiative. If anybody's been following Missouri policy, you're probably aware that we had a prohibition on a high quality early learning rating system in the state. That has been lifted as of last week. That has signed into law. So we are now developing a high quality rating system for the state of Missouri. I'm excited about that. And for the first time, last year, early learning has been paid for by the state in our unaccredited and provisionally accredited districts. We know that proper start is so essential for kids in our neediest districts, and we're starting with that component. But also, just one final comment on that. When we talk about kids coming to school ready to learn, one of our superintendents sat down about a year ago at the State Board of Education table, and the State Board of Education asked them, they were from the Boot Heel, if you're familiar with Missouri, a lot of rural generational poverty in that area. And they said, what can we do at the state to help you? And the superintendent's response was mental health services. Mm-hmm. And so I brought that back to our superintendent advisory committee, and it didn't matter if you were a superintendent in a wealthy suburban district or in deep-seated rural areas with poverty. Mental health services was of primary need to make sure that our kids are coming to school ready to learn. So we're developing partnerships with social services, working with trauma-informed schools, doing a lot of that work to ensure that our kids are ready to learn. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Commissioner, yes.
Good to see you.
Nice.
Thank you all very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So I arrived in New York a year ago next Wednesday. And like many places across the country, there was stress. Michael might know a little bit about that.
Everything was going so smoothly. I don't know what you mean.
Right.
Yes.
But let me say the good things, that over the last 5 years, we have raised standards in New York. And while we raised standards, we had our graduation rates go up. And in that time period, although we still have this lingering issue of a gap, and whether we call it an achievement gap, an opportunity gap, it is a gap, and we've got to address that issue. And so I think as we move forward, there's a number of things that are on the page that we think are extremely important, and we really want to stress across the board with our legislators. And the Regents in New York is an interesting institution in the fact that, unlike many states, the Regents is a separate entity that really is involved in education and the life of professionals in the state, as well as our cultural institutions. So an agenda we have is to break down barriers and have all of those institutions working to support our students. So let me talk to you a little bit about some of the big things that we have happening. First of all, our early childhood program is extensive. It's not universal yet, but right now the state spends about $825 million a year to support 4-year-olds and in some areas 3-year-olds. And so those slots are, we think, very important in preparing students to come ready to learn. Another thing that I think is also extremely important, the work that has been done in New York that we're continuing expanding, and that is partnerships with our university system, with SUNY and CUNY, on P-TECH programs, which are tied to career and technical. So when Freddie talks about giving students the opportunities to get into something they're excited about and doing project-based learning, ending up with ultimately a 2-year associate degree, and in some cases in having that after 4 or 5 years in high school, it really is exciting. They're also partnered with large corporations that are doing this work with us and providing opportunities to immediately have those students go into a job. And so we've expanded those. We have 28 currently, and we're planning for another 7. And so those are dispersed regionally across the state, and we want to expand those, as well as our early college high school. The target for students to be in those programs are students that have not been necessarily successful in a traditional school. They are minority students and/or students in poverty, and this is an opportunity for them to be hooked into a real-world setting. So that has been a very popular and exciting with high outcomes coming out of that. And I urge you to check that out. The P-TECH programs have been very successful in New York. And another major agenda that we have, and this past year it was led by one of our regents, Dr. Lester Young, and that is tied to My Brother's Keeper, President Obama's agenda for minority students. And the legislature has allocated $20 million, and specifically to address a number of areas where we really believe we can make a difference for our students, minority and high poverty students. So parts of that program are the extension of CTE into multiple school sites across the state, including access to higher level coursework, whether it's dual enrollment, AP, or other opportunities that we have. The CTE option that we have in New York State, prior to a year ago, we had pretty much every student with a diploma was going to take 5 Regents exams, and it was very exam driven. We have really opened that up to options, so career pathways that include over 30, up to this point, over 30 CTE pathways that students can now take. They're involved in those in high school and then end up with an external exam that gets them a certification. Very successful, and I think getting back again to Freddie's point, that those are things that students can actually, they're high interest and they end up with a credential that gets them a job. If they don't want to do that, that's fine, but they still are prepared and can then go on to post-secondary work in our colleges and ultimately universities. Another part of that, the effort that was led by Dr. Young, was the issue of having mentors in our schools. So New York State, certainly it's a majority minority state. However, less than 10% of the teachers in our schools are minority. And when we've had recent cutbacks, the students that we might have gotten in that pipeline were the first ones to be let go. And so this issue of what can we do to support teachers of color getting into that career is really an important part of what we're doing. We have an agenda with SUNY, our college and university system. It's called Teach New York. It was led by Dr. Nancy Zimpher, and we're moving to really address the issues of the teacher pipeline and support for teachers. I will tell you, I've been in this business for 45 years, and I can tell you that there is nothing more important than the teachers in the classroom. So you can imagine if you had Freddie in classrooms across all of our states, the difference it would be. So teachers are the most important. I think teachers and the focus we put on what happens with them, the supports they get, are really critical. Another key part of this is community schools. Last year, in some of our most at-risk schools, our legislature allocated $75 million for community schools in those particular schools, and there, at the time it was 22 schools identified. They have now reallocated, again, $100 million for 225 districts in the state of New York, and those districts are receiving funds specifically to provide the kinds of things that you're talking about, mental health supports, social service supports for many of our families, because we have a very high population of ELL students in areas across the state, as well as high poverty areas. And the community school model is not just a model for social services, it also includes a focus on partners supporting academic growth. So, and after-school programs, the kind of things, again, that Freddie's talking about, those extensions of a day that are some of the highlights for students, when they can go and do things that are active, interactive with their friends and a teacher supporting them. It's really powerful. Another thing that we think is extremely important is to use the models in your state. We've got some great ones, and we think that by identifying those models and using them in our state for key areas across the state, we can really change the world for things that are happening in New York State for our students. So as we move forward, I would say that the agenda can't be so focused that it's narrow. It needs to expand with principal preparation, teacher support and preparation, identification of students who want to move into certain areas and then giving them those opportunities, career and technical education, as well as high academics. So balancing all those things, that's all you have to do, Superman.
Wow, indeed, very well said. That's a big agenda. I think we just heard something like 25 different ideas. Let's dig deep into a few of them. So we know kids growing up in poverty, they're coming into school already far behind in some ways. While we need to absolutely respect the cultures they're coming from, we know there's a word gap. There's all kinds of ways that we need to help them catch up quickly. Our schools have made some progress, especially when it comes to math. You look at those achievement gap numbers for math, you look and you see in the last 20 years, big gains for especially low-performing kids, low-income kids, minority kids in mathematics, especially in the early grades. Less progress in reading. Some progress, as we have now done a better job teaching kids how to decode the English language. We've moved past the old reading wars, but it still seems like we're hitting a wall. And many of us would say, look, the problem is our elementary schools are still not doing a good enough job teaching kids how to read because we're not teaching content, right? To go back to a few sessions ago, we heard that content is not king, and that may be true once kids are older, but when it comes to learning to read, content very much is king, right? That the reason kids may not be able to understand, pick up a book and read about Tyrannosaurus Rex isn't that they can't sound out Tyrannosaurus Rex, it's that they haven't learned anything about dinosaurs. Right? Because we got rid of music and art and history and science in the elementary grades. The Common Core standards, which are called something else in some states, like Missouri now. You totally revamped your standards, I understand. Yes, nothing like the Common Core. But hypothetically, if there are states out there that still have the Common Core, they say we need content-based curriculum, especially in the early grades, but it doesn't seem like we're getting there. So I'm just curious, are there any ideas about how we can make sure we bring that kind of content back, again, to make, especially so that low-income kids can make dramatic gains in reading that's going to put them on a trajectory to do all this other great stuff that we're talking about? How can we solve this now? Education Commission of the States came out with a paper last week about a well-rounded curriculum. We've been talking about this for years. Everybody agrees we need a content-rich, well-rounded curriculum. We are not getting it done. Any ideas on that?
So I do think that the big issue really is that emphasis that was placed on standardized testing and English language arts and mathematics kind of took the air out of the room. Yep. And it focused so much on desperate skills as opposed to the big picture of comprehension. And I think the whole context of a balanced curriculum where literacy skills are used everywhere and teachers understand those connections and mathematics becomes the kind of project-based, challenging, let's work together and talk about different ways that we can solve a problem. I think those are the things that have to be infused in curriculum. It hasn't happened because we haven't had a balanced look. Now we're realizing in many places we're stepping back, and no matter what the title of the standards, we need strong standards, but they need to be connected. And when they are so characterized by single areas, it's extremely difficult. And we've focused our teachers on it. So we've got to now move their attention to crossing over into various content areas, even in kindergarten.
Yep. No, that's right. I mean, if you want to engage kindergartners, teach them about faraway places and teach them about how the world works, right?
And they like dinosaurs.
Right, they like dinosaurs, exactly. Much more so than maybe high school juniors, right? Okay, moving up kind of as kids get older. So again, they come in, we've talked about preschool some, and I know that's going to be a big focus of some of the other topics, hugely important. Let's say we do a better job in elementary school helping kids make progress on literacy, on mathematics. As we get into middle school, we have a situation now where in many high poverty schools, there are not the opportunity for those high flying kids, the high flying low income kids to have an opportunity to take those advanced courses that are going to get them on a trajectory for success. Commissioner, you talked a little bit about how you're thinking about that in Missouri. How do we make sure that kids in high poverty schools have those kinds of opportunities that kids in the affluent schools of the country have as well?
And so when I look at some of our lowest performing schools, they do actually have access to some of these programs, but here's the concern. The students don't have the exposure that engages them in those course taking patterns. So for example, one of our high schools just redid their entire program to where they were allowing children in middle school and high school select their career pathway as they were going through. Over 85% still selected general curriculum because they had no idea what they wanted to do.
Yeah.
So it's really about, it kind of is that two-way street here. How do we expose and also get them excited about learning? And that it kind of ties into what you're talking about with reading. I mean, we still have kids in middle school and high school who are struggling with reading, but our middle school and high school teachers haven't been prepared to be reading teachers because that usually happens earlier. So when they get caught behind, it is so difficult in our systems, the way they are designed, to bring them back to where we need to be. So I think that's what I was trying to talk about. How do we find where our children are, meet them there, engage them in how do you get better at reading? By reading. So we have to find something that they're excited about reading and learning. And I've walked through so many halls where they're doing worksheets to do map-like testing and things like that, which again, I'm not opposed to testing, but it has just, it has exasperated.
Let me push, and again, I'll try to be a little controversial here, okay? I would argue that if you are affluent, going to school in the suburbs, okay, like Chesterfield, where I grew up in Missouri, Parkway School District, there are still gifted and talented programs. There is tracking in middle school. There are honors courses in middle school and in high school. And so if you are achieving at a high level, you have a chance to go further faster. If you are poor, in many of our high poverty schools, we got rid of those things. We got rid of tracking, we got rid of gifted and talented programs out of the idea that that was somehow against equity, right? But as a result, what we're left with is that if you're rich, you still have access to that stuff. If you're poor, you don't. And I would argue, some of us have argued this, say, look, if we want to have a pipeline of poor kids who are ready to take advanced placement classes, to go into selective colleges, to be able to change the numbers that we're seeing up here, we've got to give those poor kids access to gifted programs too. We've got to give them access to honors courses too. We've got to overcome that resistance to say, look, we do need different pathways. And so how do you think about that? And particularly in high poverty schools. I mean, would you agree? Let's bring back gifted and talented programs for every high poverty school in America.
So if you think about it, Renzulli's Swinging Doors about gifted, every kid's gifted. If you create in a middle school environment, when middle schoolers are developmentally very excited about getting together, working together, doing things that are project-based, if you will. If you create that environment and start access to career and technical programs and other high-interest things, and some of the exposure to the different kinds of careers they might think about, middle schoolers then stay on track to think about those things when they go into ninth grade. Ninth grade's where we lose kids.
Yep.
And we have to get them hooked before they get into ninth grade.
Yeah.
And I would add to that too, I think it's not just having access, but it's having the expectation. So when we work with our teachers, when we work with our leaders in those particular schools, how do we change that culture to ensure that the expectation is set that these kids can do this, they will do this, and if they are provided the appropriate nudge to do that, they'll do it. It's just this, again, I think it comes back to the engagement level and the exposure of what that looks like. You just heard that we have many generations of, I'm the first student who's graduated from high school. And so if they don't have that mentor in there that's nudging them, that's saying, you can do this, and this is something of interest, the coursework there. Now in rural Missouri, we have a much tougher issue, and that's where we're looking at how do we better utilize distance learning or better utilize resources that are available in various school districts so that they can share the high quality teachers. I mean, that's probably our biggest issue in the access, is finding high quality teachers in high content areas in our rural districts.
And then, moving up to high school, I feel like we've kind of heard a little bit about this all this morning. We've been circling this issue. We hear about CTE, we hear about engagement, but we also hear, as you just said, that most kids are still going into this general education track. That it seems to many of us that what most American high school kids are still doing is sort of sleepwalking through these big comprehensive high schools. We call it college prep. We say they're all doing college prep, but when you dig in and you actually look at the courses and you look at the level of challenge, it's not college prep, right? It's watered down, it's not challenging. And as a result, we get kids who graduate and are not ready for the next step, right? At this point, 70% of our young people matriculate directly to college, and only 40% are ready. And that's why we have this huge remedial education crisis in higher education. So, do we need to have really say again, look, we need a system where either you take a true college prep pathway that's going to get you ready for AP courses, that's going to challenge you, that's going to get you to dual enrollment or get you ready, or you're going to take a challenging, rigorous CTE program that's going to get you ready for industry certified credentials, and we're going to get rid of the other stuff. We're going to get rid of that sort of mushy middle that is, neither college nor career readiness. Are we ready to embrace something like that?
So let me push back on you a little bit. I don't think that you have to say one or the other, okay?
Okay.
And so clearly you can have career and technical programs with kids who are also in AP classes.
Yep.
And then you have lots of options available for everyone. So the context of what opportunities you make available, they have to be there. Kids have to know what those mean. And I think that's one of the challenges we have. If you can get a student interested, very often you can't get a parent interested in having a student participate in a CTE program because they don't see that as the important thing for their student. Right. Although many of them want their kid to be able to have a career afterwards that's very productive, there's opportunities across this country in many fields that don't require four-year college degrees, but do require a good high school program and then post-secondary work. So I think we've got to change that whole kind of understanding of what does it mean to be successful and the college and career options that we have. What does it really mean to be successful for college and career? Right. And it does require earlier time, middle school into high school, but it also requires a refocus of our high schools.
Do you want to get in here, Representative?
I do. I'm very troubled by sort of the analysis that you're using because I think it's very flawed in this way. It is using that lens that I referred to earlier that already says, I know what the box looks like. And so all of the solutions have to fit into the box. I have to just say to you, you've been talking about poverty and the achievement gap, and yet we know that while the achievement gap, which is something, and it is different from the opportunity gap, does show up for students of poverty, but it also shows up for students of color. And in Washington State, we did and so we focus our efforts on trying to understand the thing we understand to a certain extent, which is poverty. But let's face it, talking about race makes most people feel very uncomfortable. And when you look at the practitioners and the policymakers, most of them don't come from the same communities and cultures that those kids who are experiencing the gap come from. And so I think one of the things that we really need to take a look at, again, is to step back and say, what is the lens we're applying and what are the flaws in our lens? Because when we did a study in Washington State that disaggregated student performance, the achievement gap, by both poverty and by race, it won't surprise many of the people I work with that achievement gap shows up for students of color from high-income families. So that says to me there is a problem in the system and the structures that you're not talking about. And that is, but I think I heard pieces of it raised in some of the work that you are doing in Missouri and New York. And what I would offer is that in Washington State, we said, yes, we can do this in a piecemeal fashion, but it's not going to move the needle unless we adopt a comprehensive approach that addresses multiple factors from accountability for English language learners to in providing cultural competency training for the vast number of educators who don't look like the kids in the gap, but who are still a necessary part of the solution, to increasing more pathways for diverse educators to enter the field, to reforming our disciplinary policies so that educators and other adults in the system understand that that the thing that a kid may get in trouble for because it's defiance or failure to comply may actually be something else, and it's part of the system's approach and changes that we need to adopt. Ultimately, you know, you asked earlier about what is it going to take to change from the littlest children to our youth whom we're preparing to send out into adulthood. What's it going to take to eliminate those gaps? Well, I would say that in an era of accountability, we have focused so much on uniformity and rigor that we've forgotten both relevance and relationships. And for our students, every single student, regardless of who they are, those relationships are often settled in community and often settled in family. And so the question I have to ask us is, how are we pulling in those family members? How are we pulling in the community? How are we making the lessons and the curriculum relevant to that Coast Salish student who could probably ace any math exam that you gave them if you asked them to do a canoe journey?
Very well said. Yes. Wow. Well, it is hard to top that, and very well said. And I don't disagree at all. You know, these issues between race and poverty, they are sometimes conflated, but they are quite different as well. And it's true. I've been focused more this morning on the poverty question, but the race question is critical. Also, I am afraid that is all the time that we have for right now. So I'm going to turn it back to Jeremy. But first, please join me in thanking our fantastic panel. Lots of great ideas.
Thank you.